Vincenzo Moretti was a ghost in plain sight, a man who built an empire without ever leaving a trace. Damian Russo was his shadow, the numbers genius who turned dirty money into invisible fortunes. Leonardo the wolf, Carvelli was the predator who ruled through fear until silence swallowed him whole, and Elena Vitale was the quiet heir rising from the background as betrayal tore the empire apart. Together, their names shaped a hidden history, a secret war of power, greed, and disappearance that the world was never meant to see. Vincenzo Moretti was not the kind of man people remembered at first glance. He blended into the crowd, dressed in plain suits that made him look more like a low-level accountant than the architect of a hidden criminal empire. Yet behind that modest appearance, he was quietly building one of the most elusive organizations in America. In the late 1980s, Chicago was already home to established mafia families, each with its own bloody history of street wars and territorial disputes, but Moretti refused to follow the same blueprint. He did not believe in open violence, which attracted attention from police and rival crews alike. Instead, he invested in silence, subtlety, and invisibility. He wanted an empire that could exist right under everyone's nose without ever being recognized as one. Moretti's plan began with real estate. Abandoned buildings and failing businesses across Chicago's suburbs became his first tools. Through front companies, he bought properties at dirt-cheap prices, repaired them just enough to look legitimate, then used them as shells to launder money. While other mobsters were still collecting protection fees in smoky back rooms, Moretti was learning how to manipulate paperwork and financial systems. His moves looked like the work of a clever businessman, not a criminal mastermind. Soon, local banks were unknowingly fueling his rise. But every mastermind needs a strategist, and for Moretti, that was Damian Russo. Unlike Moretti, Russo had an obsession with numbers and loopholes. He could make money disappear on paper, reappear overseas, and multiply before anyone understood what had happened. Together, they created Città, Nascosta, the hidden city. The name was never spoken aloud, but it was whispered in coded conversations among their earliest recruits. It was not just an organization, but an idea, a city inside the city, unseen, untouchable, and unstoppable. By the early 1990s, their reach extended beyond Chicago. Miami became another base of operations, chosen for its endless cash flow through tourism and drugs. But Città Nascosta did not sell drugs themselves. Instead, they built a network of transport companies and private security firms that quietly taxed the flow of narcotics through ports and warehouses. To outsiders, it seemed like routine business. To insiders, it was genius, earning fortunes without ever touching the product. What made Moretti extraordinary was his patience. Other bosses craved recognition, building reputations through violence and headlines. Moretti preferred the opposite. He was never caught on tape, never left fingerprints, and never issued direct orders that could be traced back to him. Associates rarely met him face to face. Instructions were filtered through layers of trusted intermediaries. His silence created an aura of myth. For many years, even investigators doubted whether he truly existed or if he was just a fabricated name used to scare rivals. Yet the signs were everywhere. A failing nightclub suddenly reopened as a profitable chain under anonymous ownership. A construction project stalled by unions moved forward after mysterious buyout. Shipping containers went missing from docks, replaced by falsified records that no one dared question. Each event looked unrelated, but taken together they painted the outline of something larger, a hidden empire growing in plain sight. Law enforcement only began to notice when they realized how untouchable Moretti's associates had become. Arrests led nowhere, witnesses vanished or changed their stories, judges were suddenly lenient, politicians unusually silent. It became clear that Città Nascosta had infiltrated not only the streets, but also the very institutions meant to protect them. Moretti's genius was not in creating fear, but in eliminating noise. He did not need shootouts or blood-stained warning. He let rivals destroy each other while his empire quietly expanded. By the time his name first appeared in federal reports, Città Nascosta already spanned multiple states with deep connections overseas. and yet to the public, Vincenzo Moretti was still nobody, a ghost hiding behind closed doors, shaping cities with nothing more than silence and patience. Would you like me to now expand Chapter 2 into 600 words in the same style? The cracks in Vincenzo Moretti's empire began not because of weakness, but because of competition. By the mid-1990s, New York's criminal world was shifting under the control of Leonardo Carvelli, a man known on the streets as the Wolf. Unlike Moretti, Carvelli had no interest in subtlety or patience. His empire was built on fear, intimidation, and spectacular shows of power. When a rival refused him, the answer came in the form of a burned business or a corpse left in the open. For Carvelli, reputation was everything, and blood was the language he spoke best. As his network expanded, New York became too small for his appetite. Chicago, with its long history of organized crime and lucrative markets, was the next prize he sought to claim. Carvelli's move was bold. He sent emissaries to make deals with local crews, promising them bigger profits and protection under his banner. But beneath those promises was a threat: join the wolf or be devoured. Small-time operators quickly submitted, but when Carvelli's influence crept closer to the network secretly controlled by Moretti, a silent war began. Unlike others before him, Carvelli never even realized the scale of the enemy he was facing. Moretti would not respond with guns or car bombs. His counterattack would be invisible. Damian Russo, Moretti's financial architect, devised a plan that struck at the heart of Carvelli's empire without leaving fingerprints. The strategy was simple in design but devastating in execution. Russo began funneling Carvelli's dirty money into fake corporations, convincing his underbosses that these new ventures were legitimate opportunities. Once the funds were committed, the corporations collapsed on paper, leaving Carvelli's allies bankrupt and desperate. It was not long before suspicion began to spread inside the Wolf's organization. To his men, it looked as though someone from within was sabotaging their operations. Distrust poisoned his ranks faster than bullets ever could. Moretti also tightened his grip on Chicago's ports and warehouses, ensuring that shipments tied to Carvelli went missing. Sometimes the cargo would vanish entirely, other times it would arrive stripped, leaving only worthless scraps inside the containers. To the outside world, it looked like logistical mishaps or customs errors, but to Carvelli it was war being waged without a single shot fired. His power began to erode as partners in South America and Europe questioned his reliability. Losing face in his world was almost worse than losing money. Frustrated and unable to identify his invisible enemy, Carvelli resorted to the only tactic he knew: violence. Bodies started appearing in New York and Chicago, not just of rivals but of his own men, executed under suspicion of betrayal. The more he searched for the leak, the weaker his organization became. Fear no longer inspired loyalty, it bred panic. Each killing created new cracks in his empire, widening them until entire factions broke away to save themselves. The Wolf's paranoia grew so severe that even his closest allies avoided him. He spoke of ghosts and shadows, enemies who never showed their faces. He began sleeping in different safe houses every night, surrounding himself with armed guards, but none of it mattered. Moretti and Russo never confronted him directly, they simply allowed him to destroy himself. The silence of Città Nascosta was more terrifying than Carvelli's brutality, because it left him fighting enemies he could never see. By the late 1990s, Carvelli was finished. His power base collapsed, his allies deserted him, and his name no longer carried fear. Then, without warning, he vanished. Some claimed he had fled overseas with what little fortune he had left. Others swore that he was executed quietly, buried beneath one of Moretti's construction projects, erased as thoroughly as his empire. No body was ever found, and no evidence ever surfaced. To law enforcement, his disappearance was a mystery. To those in the underworld, it was a message: even the loudest predator could be silenced forever. The Wolf's downfall marked the first major victory for Città Nascosta. Moretti had proven that silence could be deadlier than gunfire, and that wars could be won without the world ever realizing they had taken place. His invisible empire was no longer just surviving, it was thriving, expanding deeper into new territories, shielded by shadows and guided by patience. Do you want me to expand chapter 3 to 600 words next in the same suspenseful style? Every empire, no matter how carefully built, carries within it the seeds of its own destruction. For Vincenzo Moretti, those seeds were planted in the very heart of his empire, in the form of Damian Russo. Russo had always been Moretti's most trusted ally, the man who transformed financial chaos into order, who turned piles of dirty cash into invisible fortunes. For years Russo thrived in the shadows alongside his leader, orchestrating complex webs of shell corporations and offshore accounts. But unlike Moretti, he was not content with silence. The bigger the empire grew, the more Russo wanted recognition, not just from his associates but from the entire criminal world. At first the signs of betrayal were subtle: whispers of secret meetings in Miami nightclubs, reports of unusual shipments from South America routed through channels that bypassed Moretti's oversight. It was Elena Vitale, a young but sharp lieutenant, who first noticed the irregularity. Elena had risen quickly through the ranks, not through violence or intimidation, but through her unmatched ability to manage the legitimate-looking businesses that fronted La Città Nascosta. She was meticulous, and that attention to detail made her the perfect candidate to uncover the truth. What she discovered was shocking. Russo had begun building a faction of his own inside the organization. He negotiated directly with cartel representatives, offering them access to ports and transport routes controlled by Moretti's empire. But Russo's deals were not made in the name of La Città Nascosta, they were made for himself. Slowly he was siphoning resources, shifting funds into hidden accounts, and recruiting loyalists who believed that Russo's ambition would one day surpass Moretti's patience. The betrayal created a dangerous fracture within the empire. For years Moretti had prided himself on silence, secrecy and unity. Now distrust seeped into the ranks like poison. Associates who had once followed orders without hesitation began to whisper behind closed doors, unsure whether they served Moretti or Russo. When Elena delivered her findings to Moretti, the response was not explosive anger, instead it was cold calculation. Moretti had always believed that open violence was weakness, a sign of panic, but this betrayal cut deep. Russo was not just another rival, he was the architect of the empire itself. Without him, the delicate financial system that kept La Città Nascosta invisible could collapse. Removing him carelessly would risk exposing everything they had built. For months, Moretti and Russo operated side by side, each aware of the other's suspicions, but unwilling to make the first move. The empire became a battlefield of silence. Offshore accounts suddenly drained overnight. Businesses that once turned steady profits collapsed without warning. Shipments went missing, not due to outside enemies but from sabotage orchestrated within. Associates were forced to pick sides, though few dared admit where their loyalties lay. The tension reached its breaking point. A luxury yacht was found adrift off the coast of Miami, abandoned under the blazing sun. Inside lay the lifeless body of Damian Russo. No gunshots, no struggle, no clear cause of death, just the quiet stillness of a man whose ambition had ended at sea. The yacht contained no evidence, no fingerprints, no signs of who had been there last. Officially, his death was ruled mysterious, and no suspect was ever named. Unofficially, the underworld reached its own conclusion. Vincenzo Moretti had silenced his oldest ally. The death of Russo sent shockwaves through La Città Nascosta. Some saw it as proof of Moretti's unmatched control, a reminder that betrayal would never be tolerated. Others viewed it as a warning that even the most loyal lieutenants were expendable. But perhaps the one who gained the most from the fallout was Elena Vitale. Having exposed Russo's schemes and proven her loyalty, she quickly rose in influence, becoming one of Moretti's most trusted confidants. Yet the damage was already done. Though Russo was gone, the scars of his betrayal lingered. The empire was no longer unified. Hidden resentments festered among those who had secretly sided with Russo, and Moretti could never be certain of their true loyalty. The silence that had once been the strength of La Città Nascosta now felt heavy with mistrust. Moretti himself seemed to change after Russo's death. The patience that had defined him grew sharper, colder. Associates whispered that he no longer trusted anyone completely, not even Elena.
Meetings became rarer, instructions more cryptic, and punishments swifter. What had once been an empire built on quiet control now carried the shadow of paranoia. The silent war that had destroyed Leonardo Carvelli had now turned inward, leaving scars on Moretti's own creation. Though La Città Nascosta remained powerful, it was no longer unbreakable. A single betrayal had shaken the foundations, proving that silence, while deadly, could also hide treachery within. The empire still stood, but its stability was already crumbling, piece by piece, in ways no one could yet fully see. Do you want me to expand Chapter 4 into 750 words as well, making the finale even more haunting and conclusive? By the 2010s, Vincenzo Moretti's empire was vast yet strangely fragile. On the surface, La Città Nascosta still controlled shipping routes, real estate fronts, and financial pipelines that stretched from Chicago to Miami and across oceans. But beneath that surface, cracks widened. The betrayal of Damian Russo had never fully healed, and though Russo's body was gone, his shadow lingered. Trust inside the empire had thinned, and with it the efficiency that had once made Moretti untouchable. The world outside had also changed. Technology was advancing at a pace neither Moretti nor his associates could ignore. International banks were under tighter scrutiny. Money laundering schemes that once slipped by unnoticed were now flagged by sophisticated software, and global agencies began sharing information in ways that closed the gaps Moretti had always relied upon. His strategy of silence, which once guaranteed invisibility, was suddenly at risk of being exposed by nothing more than an algorithm. Authorities across the United States and Europe grew bolder in their pursuit. Investigations that once hit dead ends began to show patterns. Companies with no real owners, properties that shifted names too frequently, offshore accounts that drained at suspicious intervals. For the first time in decades, Moretti's name surfaced in whispered briefings among federal investigators. He was still a ghost, but the hunt for him was gaining ground. What followed was not a dramatic showdown, not a series of arrests or courtroom trials, but something far stranger. Just as pressure was building to its highest point, La Città Nascosta began to evaporate. Businesses shuttered overnight. Accounts that had once been full of laundered millions went dark, emptied as if by invisible hands. Associates who had been fixtures in Chicago vanished, leaving behind abandoned homes and disconnected phones. Whole layers of the organization dissolved without warning, leaving investigators with nothing but fragments. The most haunting mystery was Moretti himself. One week, intelligence suggested he was in Miami, watching over a new project along the waterfront. The next, rumors placed him in Sicily, returning to old family roots. Then, silence. No confirmed sightings, no trace of travel, no financial signature. It was as if he had stepped off the map entirely. Some believed Moretti staged his own death. The theory spread quickly. He had used his vast resources to create a new identity, disappearing into the kind of luxury only a lifetime of hidden wealth could buy. Others claimed Elena Vitale, his rising lieutenant, had orchestrated the final vanishing act, draining the empire's accounts and erasing its footprints to secure her survival. Supporters of this version pointed to the precision with which La Città Nascosta folded in on itself, too organized to be a collapse, and too deliberate to be coincident. A darker theory whispered through the underworld, suggested that Moretti had cut a final secret deal with the very authorities who hunted him. In exchange for his freedom, he may have offered information that dismantled his own organization. If true, it meant the man who once built an empire on silence had chosen betrayal as his final move. But no evidence ever confirmed this, leaving the truth forever uncertain. For the victims of his empire, the disappearance brought no closure. Families ruined by financial scams never saw justice. Politicians who had once accepted quiet envelopes of cash never faced exposure. Rivals destroyed in the silent war with Carvelli never learned who had truly orchestrated their downfall. All that remained were whispers of a city within a city, a hidden empire that had ruled without recognition and then vanished without warning. The legend of Vincenzo Moretti only grew in his absence. To some he was proof that the perfect crime could exist, that a man could rise to power, control cities and then erase himself so thoroughly that even history struggled to hold on to him. To others he was a cautionary tale of paranoia and betrayal, a reminder that no empire, no matter how silent, could last forever. Years later, abandoned buildings in Chicago still carried faint traces of his empire. Old nightclubs where money once flowed like water stood empty, collecting dust. Properties that once served as fronts fell into decay, the paperwork surrounding them too complicated to unravel. On the docks of Miami, longshoremen still told stories of containers that vanished without explanation, shipments redirected by unseen hands. These remnants were all that remained of La Città Nascosta, a ghostly footprint, fading but never fully gone. In the end, the empire did not collapse with gunfire or sirens. It dissolved like smoke, leaving questions that will never be answered. Did Moretti die quietly, hidden from the world he once ruled? Did Elena Vitale inherit what was left, reshaping it under a new disguise? Or did the empire simply retreat into an even deeper silence, waiting for the world to forget before rising again? The truth may never be known. What is certain is that the wars Moretti fought were unlike any other in Mafia history. They were not won with bullets or blood, but with shadows, patience and betrayal. They were wars so silent that most people never even knew they were happening. And in the world of organized crime, silence remains the loudest weapon of all.